The gun was pressed against Roscoe Monroe's chest when Evelyn Wainwright said the words that broke something open inside of her she had not even known was sealed shut. "Do not shoot him," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her, because her hands were not steady at all. They were trembling against the sides of her skirt. "Do not shoot him, Harrison, or I will tell every soul in Redemption County what you did to those land deeds." The man holding the gun, Harrison Colt, who was not a lawman despite the silver badge he wore on his chest, who was not a gentleman despite the expensive coat he had shipped from St. Louis, who was not anything he claimed to be, turned slowly to look at her. His eyes were the pale gray of January sky and just as cold. Roscoe had not moved. He stood with his back against the wall of the Redemption County Land Office, his dark eyes fixed on Evelyn with an expression she could not name. It was not gratitude, though there was gratitude somewhere in it. It was not surprise, though clearly he had not expected her to walk through that door. It was something rawer than either of those things, something that looked, despite the gun barrel pressing into his sternum, almost like recognition. "Evelyn," Harrison Colt said her name the way a man says the name of something he owns. "You do not want to do this." "I already did it," she said. "I sent copies of those documents to Judge Abernethy in Santa Fe 3 days ago. Shooting this man will not stop what is coming for you. It will only add murder to your list of sins." The room was silent except for the wind pressing against the warped wooden shutters and the distant sound of horses on the packed dirt street outside. The year was 1878. The town of Dry Hollow, New Mexico Territory, sat in a valley between red mesas that went orange at sunset and black at night, and it was the kind of place that had grown fast and crooked, the way things do when there is money involved and not enough law to keep it honest. Roscoe Monroe had ridden into Dry Hollow 11 days ago. Evelyn Wainwright had been there for 8 months. Neither of them had been looking for the other. But there are things in this world that do not ask permission before they arrive. Harrison Colt looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and then he lowered the gun. Not because he was a good man and not because he was afraid of her, but because he was a calculating man, and in that moment his calculations told him that shooting Roscoe Monroe in front of a witness who had already sent documents to a federal judge was not in his interest. He stepped back. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive coat. He smiled, which was worse than the gun. "This is not over," he said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "It is not." He left. The door swung shut behind him and banged once against the frame before the wind caught it and held it still. Roscoe Monroe let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting a long time to be released. He looked at Evelyn across the length of the small office, across the overturned chair and the scattered papers and the single oil lamp that had been knocked sideways on the desk and was casting everything in a lurching, unsteady light. "I do not know what to call what this is," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like wood that had been left out in all kinds of weather. She looked at him. At the blood on his temple where someone had hit him earlier that evening, which was partly how he had ended up with his back against this wall, and Harrison Colt's gun in his chest. At the way he was standing, not relaxed exactly, but present in a way that some men simply were not, as though he occupied his own body completely and without apology. "Neither do I," she said. "But do not stop." He blinked. "Do not stop what?" She realized she did not entirely know. She had meant something by it, something about the look on his face, about the fact that for the first time in 8 months in this town she had felt, standing in this doorway, that she was walking toward something rather than away from it. "Whatever it is you are doing," she said, "do not stop." The lamp flickered. Outside, Dry Hollow went on existing the way it always did, full of its ordinary and extraordinary cruelties, its dust and its hunger and its occasional grace. But in that small office, with the papers on the floor and the blood on his face and her heart doing something she had no immediate name for, something had begun. 8 months before that night, Evelyn Wainwright had arrived in Dry Hollow on the Thursday afternoon stage from Albuquerque with 2 large trunks, a leather satchel full of documents and surveying tools, and a letter of appointment from the Territorial Land Office authorizing her to conduct a survey of disputed land parcels in the Dry Hollow district. She was 26 years old. She had studied land surveying under her father, Thomas Wainwright, who had been one of the most respected surveyors in the New Mexico Territory before a fall from a horse had broken 3 of his ribs, 2 of which had healed badly, leaving him with a persistent cough that the doctor in Albuquerque said would worsen with physical exertion. Thomas had appealed to the Territorial Land Office on his daughter's behalf. The Land Office, which had more disputed parcels than it had surveyors, and which was, on some philosophical level, less concerned with the gender of its agents than with the number of them, had agreed. Dry Hollow had not entirely known what to make of her. Some people had been openly hostile men who believed that women had no business carrying survey chains through the scrub brush, or reading compass bearings, or filing official reports with federal offices. Some people had been elaborately polite in the way that felt more like a wall than a welcome. A few people had simply accepted her, mostly because they were busy with their own troubles and had no time to manufacture additional ones on her behalf. The postmaster, a spare, cheerful man named Ezra Flood who had lost 2 fingers to a thrashing machine in Ohio and now sorted letters with remarkable efficiency, had given her the name of a decent boarding house run by a widow named Clara Beaumont. Clara Beaumont had given her a clean room, strong coffee every morning, and the kind of quiet company that asked nothing and offered everything. Evelyn had been grateful for all of it. She had also, from almost her first week in Dry Hollow, been running into the problem of Harrison Colt. Colt had arrived in Dry Hollow approximately 2 years before Evelyn and had, in those 2 years, managed to become the single most powerful man in the county. He owned the largest cattle operation in the district. He owned stakes in 2 of the 3 general stores. He had, through means that were not entirely clear to anyone who looked too closely at them, managed to acquire land deeds for parcels that, according to the records Evelyn had been sent to verify, had not been his to acquire. Evelyn had seen this kind of thing before. Her father had told her about it. In the Wild West of 1878, the land was the treasure, and the treasure attracted men who were willing to do terrible things to keep it. Forged documents, intimidated witnesses, bought officials, sometimes worse. She had been careful. She had documented everything. She had, 3 days before the night she walked into the land office and found Roscoe Monroe at gunpoint, quietly sent everything she had discovered to Judge Abernethy in Santa Fe, including copies of the original deeds that contradicted the ones Harrison Colt had filed. What she had not anticipated was Roscoe Monroe. He had ridden into Dry Hollow on a Tuesday, which was a small, unremarkable detail, except that it was the same Tuesday on which Evelyn had been crouching in the red dust 2 miles east of town, trying to get an accurate reading on a disputed boundary line, and he had nearly ridden his horse directly over her survey chain. "Watch where you are going," she had said, looking up from her compass. He had pulled his horse up short, which the horse had not appreciated, and looked down at her with an expression of genuine surprise. "I beg your pardon. My chain," she said, pointing. "You were about to ride over it." He had looked at the survey chain, which was stretched across the dry ground between 2 iron pins, and then he had looked at her, and there had been a long pause in which something was established between them that neither of them could have articulated at the time. Some fundamental recognition of the fact that the other person was not quite what they had expected to find in this particular stretch of the New Mexico Territory. He dismounted carefully, led his horse around the chain, and then stood looking at her work with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than the performative tolerance she usually received from men who encountered her in the field. "What is the dispute?" he asked. She had told him. She had not meant to go into as much detail as she did, but he had asked the right questions, intelligent, specific questions that told her he understood land and the law around it, or at least understood enough to ask about it sensibly, and she had found herself explaining the whole tangle of the competing claims on the eastern parcels while the afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky above them. "And who is on the other side of the dispute?" he asked. "A man named Harrison Colt," she said. Something had shifted in his expression at that. Not much. Just a slight tightening around the eyes, a small adjustment in the set of his jaw. "I have heard that name," he said. She had looked at him more carefully then. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of outdoor work. His clothes were practical and not new worn boots, canvas trousers, a dark shirt under a leather vest. He wore a revolver on his right hip, which was not unusual in the territory in 1878, but he wore it with the comfortable ease of someone for whom it was a tool rather than a statement. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his early 30s. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that might have been from squinting in the sun or might have been from something else entirely. "You have heard it," she said. "In what context?" He had looked at her for a moment and then he had said, "My name is Roscoe Monroe. I have ridden a long way and I would appreciate knowing what sort of trouble I am riding into before I ride into it any further." She had said, "Evelyn Wainwright, and the trouble is considerable." He had nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he had helped her collect her survey chain, which she had not asked him to do but which he had done with a natural, unself-conscious efficiency that she found. She did not resent the way she usually resented that kind of assistance from men who offered it as a way of demonstrating that they could do her job better than she could. He was not demonstrating anything. He was simply helping. It was, she would think later, the first of many things he did that she did not know how to categorize. He took a room at the Dry Hollow Hotel, which was a two-story wooden building on the main street that described itself as a hotel in the same way that Harrison Colt described himself as a legitimate businessman, with more confidence than accuracy. He ate his suppers at the restaurant attached to the hotel. He spent his days, as far as Evelyn could tell, talking to people. Not in a suspicious way, but in the methodical way of someone who was building a picture. She had discovered on his third day in Dry Hollow what picture he was building. She had been coming out of the land office late in the afternoon when she had nearly walked directly into him on the porch steps, which created a brief moment of physical proximity that she had moved away from more quickly than was perhaps entirely necessary. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said, which was technically true but felt in the moment of saying it slightly more cold than she intended. "Nevertheless," he said. He held the door to the land office open. "May I?" She had gone back inside. He had come in after her. They had sat across from each other at the large table that served as her working surface when the land office clerk, a young man named Tobias who was enthusiastic about filing and terrified of confrontation, was not using it. Roscoe Monroe had told her about his brother. His younger brother, Daniel Monroe, who had come to the Dry Hollow district 4 years ago and had filed a legitimate claim on a piece of land northeast of the town, had built a small house, had started raising cattle. Who had 2 years ago received a letter from a law office in Santa Fe, informing him that his deed was being contested by a man named Harrison Colt on the grounds that Daniel's original filing had contained irregularities. Who had 8 months ago, the same month that Evelyn had arrived in Dry Hollow, though neither of them had known the other then, been found dead, in circumstances that the county sheriff, a man named Prout who owed his job to Harrison Colt's political connections, had ruled an accident. "I do not believe it was an accident," Roscoe said. His voice was flat and even the way voices sometimes get when the feeling behind them is too large to let any color through. "I believe Harrison Colt had my brother killed because Daniel was preparing to contest the land claim in court and because Daniel had found something, a witness, a man who had been present when the original deed documents were altered." Evelyn had been very still. "What happened to the witness?" "Gone," Roscoe said. "Left the territory. I have been looking for him for 3 months." She had looked at the documents spread across the table. Her documents, her months of careful work. "Roscoe," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it had come out naturally enough that neither of them remarked on it. "I think I may have found something that connects to what you are looking for." He had leaned forward. The lamp on the table between them threw the planes of his face into relief, made shadows in the hollows under his cheekbones. "Tell me," he said. She had told him everything. Not because she trusted him completely. She had been in Dry Hollow long enough to know that trust was a thing you built carefully, like a stone wall, one piece at a time. But because his grief was real, and his purpose was real, and she had been carrying the weight of what she knew alone for long enough that the prospect of sharing it with someone who had both the intelligence to understand it and the motivation to do something about it was something she could not bring herself to refuse. They had talked for 4 hours that evening. Tobias the clerk had gone home. The street outside had gone quiet. Evelyn had sent out at some point for bread and cold meat from the restaurant, and they had eaten it at the table without stopping talking, and she had not noticed until afterward that she had not once felt self-conscious or monitored in the way she usually felt when she was working alongside men who did not quite believe she belonged in the room. He had treated her knowledge as knowledge, her judgments as judgments, her conclusions as conclusions. He had argued with 2 of her interpretations, clearly and specifically, and had turned out to be right about one of them and wrong about the other, and when she had demonstrated why he was wrong about the second he had said, "Yes, I see it now," and had adjusted his thinking without any visible resentment. She had gone back to Clara Beaumont's boarding house that night and had lain in her bed looking at the ceiling and had thought with some alarm that she was in considerable danger, not from Harrison Colt, from something considerably harder to defend against. They had spent the following 6 days working. It was the only word for it, and it was entirely accurate, and it also concealed, the way accurate words sometimes do, a great deal that it did not name. They worked through the land records together. They identified 3 separate instances in which original deeds had been replaced with altered versions, the alterations done with enough skill that they would likely have passed unnoticed if Evelyn had not had access to the original territorial filings in Albuquerque, copies of which she had brought with her. They rode out together twice to look at boundary markers, and on both occasions she had been aware of him in the way she was not usually aware of people she was working with, the particular way he moved through open country, quiet and observant, missing nothing. The fact that when she stopped to take a compass reading, he simply waited without fidgeting or offering unnecessary assistance. The one time when she had slipped on loose shale on a hillside and he had caught her arm, and then when she had steadied herself he had let go immediately, which had somehow made the brief contact feel more rather than less significant. They had been followed on the second ride. She had noticed it first, a figure on a pale horse keeping to the ridge above them, and had pointed it out quietly. He had glanced up once, unhurried, and then had continued as though he had not seen it, but she had noticed that after that he positioned himself slightly differently relative to her as they rode, and she understood that he was placing himself between her and whoever was above them on the ridge without making any particular performance of the fact. That evening back in town he had said, "Colt knows we are looking at the records together. We should be careful." "I have been careful," she said. "More careful than that," he said. She had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and there was a moment in which several things were almost said and were not said, and then the moment had passed, but it had left something behind it, the way weather leaves the air changed even after it moves on. It was on the 8th day that things had accelerated. Roscoe had gone to the land office in the morning to look at a specific document they had not yet been able to locate, a transfer deed from 1875 that should have been in the records but was not, which was itself a significant fact. Evelyn had gone to meet with a rancher named Portillo on the south side of town, a man whose land bordered one of the disputed parcels and who had indicated, carefully and indirectly over several previous conversations, that he might have information relevant to the case. Portillo had told her, over coffee in his kitchen while his wife moved quietly in the background and his children played outside, that he had seen men coming and going from the land office late at night, 2 years ago, in the weeks before Harrison Colt had filed his contested claims. He had seen, once, a man he recognized as Colt's foreman carrying a leather case that Portillo believed contained documents. He had not come forward before because he had a family and a ranch, and Harrison Colt was the most powerful man in the county, and he had not believed anyone would do anything with the information that would not simply get him killed. "But you are telling me now," Evelyn said. "I am telling you because you sent those documents to Santa Fe," Portillo said. "I heard from Ezra Flood that you did. And because my neighbor Manuel Torres lost his land to Colt's claims last year and is now working for wages on land his father built, and I am tired of watching that kind of thing happen." She had thanked him and ridden back toward town and had arrived at the land office to find the door standing open and Tobias the clerk sitting on the porch steps looking pale and frightened. "He took Mr. Monroe," Tobias said. "Colt's men. They came with Colt himself. They said Mr. Monroe was found with documents that were not his to have. They took him inside." She had not hesitated. She had gone straight to Clara Beaumont's boarding house, which was where she kept her most important papers, retrieved what she needed, and walked directly to the land office, which was how she had ended up in the doorway with Harrison Colt's gun at Roscoe's chest and her voice coming out steadier than her hands. In the days after that night, the town of Dry Hollow held its breath. Harrison Colt did not shoot anyone. He withdrew, the way a man withdraws when he is calculating rather than panicking, pulling his forces back and regrouping. He was not the kind of man who made reckless mistakes in the heat of anger. He was the kind of man who was patient and thorough, and absolutely committed to his own survival, which made him considerably more dangerous than the reckless kind. Roscoe had the cut on his temple cleaned and closed by the town's physician, a tired-looking man named Dr. Harlan Webb, who had seen enough of Harrison Colt's work over the past 2 years that he did not ask many questions when Roscoe told him how he had gotten it. Evelyn had accompanied him to Dr. Webb's office, not because he needed her to, but because she had found that she was disinclined to let him out of her sight until the immediate danger had passed, and because Roscoe had not suggested that she leave, which she had noted. "It is not deep," Dr. Webb said, working with careful hands. "He hit you with something flat, the butt of the gun, I would guess." "That is accurate," Roscoe said. He was sitting on the examining table and looking straight ahead, and his eyes found Evelyn's across the small room and stayed there for a moment with that expression she still did not have a name for. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Walking back from Dr. Webb's office in the blue-gray early evening light, Dry Hollow's main street quiet around them, Roscoe had said, "You did not have to come in there tonight." "I know that," she said. "Colt could have turned the gun on you." "He could have," she said. "He did not, because he is calculating." "Yes. That will not always protect you," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her, and the last of the evening light was behind him and his face was in shadow, but she could see his eyes clearly enough. "I have been taking care of myself in this town for 8 months, she said, not with anger exactly, more with a kind of clarity, as though she was reading something aloud that she wanted to make certain he understood correctly. "I know what Harrison Colt is. I know what he is capable of. I did not walk into that office without understanding what I was doing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I am not saying you cannot take care of yourself. I am saying that I would not want you to be harmed." "Those are different things." She looked at him. The distinction he had drawn was exact, and it landed somewhere specific inside her. "All right," she said. "They are different things." They walked on. The stars were coming out over the mesas, scattered and cold and impossibly numerous, and the town made its small nighttime sounds around them, a horse shifting in a corral, someone playing a fiddle somewhere, the distant conversation of men coming out of the saloon. Evelyn thought about the documents in Santa Fe, about Portillo's testimony, about the missing transfer deed, about the way all of it was moving towards something that felt both inevitable and precarious. She thought about what Roscoe had said. "I would not want you to be harmed," she thought. "Neither would I want harm to come to you." And the thought had a weight to it that surprised her. Clara Beaumont had left supper for Evelyn on the table in the boarding-house kitchen, covered with a cloth. Roscoe walked her to the door, which she had not expected, and stood for a moment on the porch. "Tomorrow," he said, "we need to find that 1875 deed." "I have an idea about where it might be," she said. "There is a clerk in the Territorial Records Office in Albuquerque who I have been corresponding with. I think the original may have been filed there and never transferred to the county records. Can you wire him tonight? I can have Ezra Flood send a telegram in the morning." He nodded, and then he stood there for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary given that the conversation was finished, and she stood there too, and the night between them was warm and smelled of red dust and dry sage, and Dry Hollow was quiet enough that she could hear, very faintly, that distant fiddle still playing. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said, and then waited. He seemed to search for words for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, for tonight, for what you did." "I had my own reasons for doing it," she said. "I know, that does not make me less grateful." There are several things I could say right now." She said, "Good night, Roscoe." "Good night," he said. She went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the door frame and listened to his footsteps going down the porch steps and along the street, steady and unhurried, and felt something move through her that was warm and uncomfortable and entirely unwelcome. And also, she admitted to herself in the privacy of her own chest, entirely welcome. She ate her supper. She went to bed. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. The telegram went out the next morning, and the reply came back in the afternoon. Yes, there was a transfer deed on file from 1875 for the northeast parcel, filed originally under the name Monroe, and it had not been transferred to the Dry Hollow County Records Office, and the Albuquerque clerk could send a certified copy to Santa Fe within 48 hours. Evelyn read the reply twice and then walked to the hotel to find Roscoe. He was sitting in the small lobby reading a copy of the Santa Fe New Mexican that was 3 days old. He stood when she came in, and she handed him the telegram without speaking, and watched his face as he read it. Something moved through his expression that was very different from anything she had seen on it before. It was not the careful, steady competence of a man working a problem. It was something that came from deeper than that, something that had been waiting under all that steadiness for a long time. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with calculation or strategy. "That is Daniel's deed," he said. His voice was even, but only by effort. "Yes," she said. He folded the telegram carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked out the window at the street for a moment, at the ordinary, indifferent life of Dry Hollow going about its business. Then he looked back at her. "It is almost enough," he said. "With what you already sent to Santa Fe with Portillo's testimony, it is enough," she said. "I believe it is enough." He exhaled, long and slow, like a man who has been holding something very heavy and is finally allowed to set it down. "Then what do we do now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "we wait for the law." Waiting was hard. Waiting was particularly hard in a town where Harrison Colt was still walking the streets, still tipping his hat to people, still wearing that expensive coat and that cold smile, as though the ground under him had not already begun to give way. He looked at Evelyn when their paths crossed, and in a town of Dry Hollow's size they crossed, with a look that was not quite a threat but was designed to feel like one, the look of a man who is reminding you that he has not forgotten you. She looked back. She had learned in 8 months not to flinch. The tension of those waiting days did something else too. It created a kind of enforced intimacy between Evelyn and Roscoe that ordinary circumstances might not have produced so quickly. They were, in a practical sense, co-conspirators, which meant they needed to stay in contact, to share information as it came in, to make decisions together about what to do and when. They met every day. They talked every day. The talking, which had begun as a purely practical exchange of information, gradually took on layers that were not entirely practical. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri on a farm, the older of two brothers, that his father had died when he was 15, and he had essentially raised Daniel through the rest of their adolescence while their mother, a sharp, quiet woman named Ruth, had kept the farm going. That he had come west at 20, because the farm could not support two grown men, and Daniel had been the one who wanted to stay. That he had spent 10 years in various parts of the territory doing various kinds of work, some surveying, some ranch work, some time as a deputy in a town whose name she recognized from her father's stories as a place that had been rough and is now gone. That the work of finding out what had happened to Daniel had consumed him so completely for the past 8 months that he had, in some practical sense, not been thinking about anything else. And before that, she said one afternoon, they were sitting on the porch of the boarding house because the day was fine and the interior of the building was hot, and Clara Beaumont had brought them each a glass of cold water and then gone tactfully about her business. Before Daniel died, what were you doing? He thought about it for a moment. Living, he said. Trying to anyway. I had land of my own north of Taos, a small place, horses mostly. I was considering whether to expand it. He paused. I sold it when I came looking for who killed Daniel. I needed money for travel and I did not know how long it would take. She felt the weight of that. Everything he had built for himself, sold to pursue justice for his brother. That must have been difficult, she said. It was necessary, he said. Simply, without self-pity, the way people speak when they are telling the truth about something they have already fully accepted. She told him about her own life, too, which she was less accustomed to doing, about growing up following her father from survey to survey across the territory, learning the work before she learned most other things. About the particular loneliness of being skilled at something that most people you encountered did not believe you should be doing. About her mother, who had died when Evelyn was 14, and whose absence had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. Did you ever want to do something else? He asked. Something other than surveying, she considered it honestly. I thought about it sometimes when I was younger, medicine, law, things that required argument and precision, but I came back always to the land because I understood it. I understood the way it could be described, bounded, made legible. She turned her glass of water in her hands. My father always said that the most important thing a surveyor does is make the invisible visible. The invisible lines that make the difference between what belongs to a person and what does not. I found that meaningful. I still do. He was watching her with that expression, the one she still did not have a complete name for but was coming to associate with the particular experience of being seen by him, fully, without reservation, without any of the filtering and diminishment she had encountered so often in her professional life. It is meaningful work, he said. What you have done here has been meaningful. What we have done, she said. What we have done, he agreed. The reply from Santa Fe came on the 14th day after that first night, and it came in the form not of a letter but of a man, a federal marshal named Cal Devers, who rode into Dry Hollow on a dry, brilliant Wednesday morning with 2 deputies, and a warrant for Harrison Colt's arrest on charges of land fraud, tampering with public records, and pending further investigation, complicity in the death of Daniel Monroe. Evelyn was at the land office when Marshal Devers arrived. She watched from the window as he and his deputies rode up the main street. She felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. Roscoe came to the land office 20 minutes later. He must have seen the marshal arrive. His face was composed, but his eyes were very bright. He will fight it, Roscoe said. He will, she agreed. He has lawyers in Santa Fe. It will take time. But the documents are real. Portillo's testimony is real. The Albuquerque deed is real. Yes, she said. They are real and they are filed and they are not going anywhere. He nodded. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and she could see him processing it. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of relief. The first crack in a wall that had been solid for 8 months. She said quietly, "It will not bring him back." He looked at her. His eyes were very steady. "No," he said, "nothing will bring him back, but it will mean that what happened to him did not happen in the dark, that it was seen, that it mattered." He paused. "That matters to me." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, which was something she had not done before, closed the distance like that deliberately without the pretense of practicality. She looked up at him. He was considerably taller than her, but he had a quality of making his height feel like shelter rather than dominance. "It matters," she said. "What happened to Daniel matters, and you did not give up on it." "That matters too." Something in his face shifted. The careful steadiness he wore like armor over everything else. It did not disappear exactly, but it moved, the way armor moves when the person inside it finally allows themselves to breathe. He reached up slowly and touched her face with one hand. Just his fingers, just along her jaw, the touch of someone who is aware of the significance of what they are doing and is doing it deliberately. His skin was rough and warm. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said. "And then, I know. I do not know what to call what this is," he said. The words were different this time than they had been in the land office with the gun and the lurching lamplight. They were not confused. They were wondering. There is a difference between a man who is lost and a man who is standing at the edge of something large and new and allowing himself to feel the size of it. "Neither do I," she said. "But do not stop." This time he understood what she meant immediately, or perhaps he had always understood in both moments when she had said it. He bent his head and kissed her, very carefully at first, the way you are careful with something you intend to take serious care of, and then less carefully, because she kissed him back, and that changed the arithmetic of the moment significantly. Outside, Marshal Devers was arresting Harrison Colt on the steps of the county courthouse. She could hear, distantly, the sound of voices raised. Inside, the land office held them both in its dusty, document-filled ordinariness, and outside the windows the red mesas were orange in the midday light, and Dry Hollow's Main Street went about its ordinary business, and Evelyn Wainwright stood in Roscoe Monroe's arms and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They broke apart, both of them somewhat breathless, and looked at each other. "Complicated," she said. "Extraordinarily," he agreed. She laughed, which surprised her, and the sound of it surprised her even more because it was entirely genuine and entirely without self-consciousness, which was not something she could say about many sounds she made in public. He smiled. It was, she thought, a remarkably good smile. She had not seen it enough in the past 2 weeks, which had not allowed for much smiling. "What happens now?" he asked. "You have to give a deposition to Marshal Devers," she said. "And so do I, and there will be proceedings in Santa Fe that will probably require both of us to be present at some point." "Practically speaking," he said. "Yes, but I was asking about the other thing." She considered him. The careful way he was watching her, not assuming, not pressing, simply asking an honest question and waiting for an honest answer. "I do not know," she said. "My appointment in Dry Hollow ends when this survey is complete. The survey is nearly complete. I will need to report back to the territorial land office, and then there will be a new appointment somewhere." "I no longer have land in Taos," he said. "I sold it. I could go anywhere." "You could go anywhere," she agreed. "I could go wherever your next appointment is," he said, "if you wanted that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the past 2 weeks, which had been dangerous and difficult, and also the most fully alive she had felt in a long time. She thought about the fact that she had been carrying the weight of this work alone, and that having him alongside her had not diminished her but had simply made the weight bearable, which was what good company did. She thought about his hands and his voice and the way he asked intelligent questions and did not flinch from hard truths and had touched her face like something precious. "Let me finish this survey," she said, "and give my deposition, and then we can talk about what comes after." He nodded. "All right," he said. And then with that small smile, "But not knowing what to call it does not bother me for what it is worth." "No," she said, "nor me." The deposition took 2 days. Marshal Devers was a thorough man which Evelyn respected, and he asked his questions carefully and recorded the answers in a neat, systematic hand. He interviewed Evelyn first, then Roscoe, then sent one of his deputies to take a formal statement from Portillo, who gave it with the quiet determination of a man who has decided that some things are more important than staying safe. The deputy also located 2 additional witnesses, a former employee of Colt's operation who had seen documents being altered and had left the territory shortly afterward, and a clerk who had been working in the county record's office 2 years ago and had been paid with cash to look the other way on a particular night. Harrison Colt was held in the Dry Hollow jail, a solid adobe structure that he had, ironically, partially funded the construction of. His Santa Fe lawyers arrived 3 days later, expensive and confident, and the legal proceedings that followed were complex and slow-moving in the way that legal proceedings in the territory were when one party had significant resources to spend on delay. But the evidence was solid. Evelyn's work, careful and methodical, and conducted by someone who understood the documents and the law around them as well as anyone in the territory, was the backbone of the case. The Albuquerque deed was genuine and certified. Portillo's testimony was detailed and consistent. The 2 additional witnesses added corroboration that the lawyers found difficult to explain away. It took 9 months. 9 months during which Evelyn completed her survey, filed her final report with the Territorial Land Office, received a commendation from the Land Office Director, which was, as she understood, unprecedented for a woman in her position, and which she accepted with appropriate grace and private satisfaction, and was offered a new appointment in a district south of Santa Fe. During those 9 months, Roscoe Monroe remained in Dry Hollow. He took work where he could find it ranch work initially, and then, as word of his practical knowledge and his reliability spread, work helping other ranchers with their own land records, identifying boundary disputes, navigating the documentation that the territory required. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things that fit the particular shape of their minds, and the work suited him, and it kept him close. He was close in the other sense, too. They did not rush what was between them, partly because neither of them was a person who rushed things, and partly because the circumstances of their days were complicated enough that rushing felt impractical, and partly because what was between them seemed to have its own rhythm that neither of them needed to force. He came to Clara Beaumont's boarding house for supper twice a week, and Clara Beaumont set an extra place without being asked after the first 2 times. He and Evelyn walked together in the evening sometimes, along the edge of town where the ground opened up toward the mesas, and talked about the case, about their pasts, about the territory and the law and the land and the future, which was a country neither of them had mapped yet but both of them could feel. He kissed her for the second time on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the first time, standing outside the boarding house in the warm dark, and this time neither of them called it complicated, because it was not complicated, or rather it was exactly as complicated as most true things are, and that level of complication was no reason to hesitate. She had thought once or twice about whether she was being reckless. She had built her independence carefully over years in the face of considerable resistance, and there were women in her mother's generation, and even in her own who had lost that independence to marriage, whose particular knowledge and skill had been absorbed into a household and a husband's life and rendered invisible. She had thought about that. She had thought about her mother, who had loved her father but who had also given up a good deal to be with him. But Roscoe Monroe did not want her to be less. That was what she had understood, slowly and then all at once, over those weeks of close working and careful conversation. He did not want her to put down her instruments and her maps and her surveying chain and become something smaller. He was curious about her work. He respected it. He had once said matter-of-factly that she was the most capable person he had met in the territory, and the way he said it had made clear that he was not making an exception for her gender. He was simply describing what he observed. When she told him about the south of Santa Fe appointment, he said, "Tell me about the district. I have not been there." She showed him the preliminary maps. He looked at them carefully and asked several good questions. Then he said, "The land records office in that district is run by a man named Reeves. I met him once years ago. He is competent but cautious. He will cooperate with you once he understands that you know what you are doing, but the first week may require some patience." She had looked at him. "You are speaking as though you are coming with me." "I am hoping to come with you," he said. "I have not been invited yet." She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Consider yourself invited." He nodded once, with a gravity that was entirely serious and also, around the edges, entirely warm. "Then I accept." Harrison Colt was convicted in Santa Fe on a Thursday in late autumn, 9 months after his arrest. The jury deliberated for less than a day. He was sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison on the land fraud charges, with additional charges related to Daniel Monroe's death still under investigation. His cattle operation was sold. His land acquisitions, all of them, were declared invalid, and the original owners, or, where those owners had died, their heirs, received their titles back. Manuel Torres, whose father's land had been taken, received the deed to his father's ranch on a cold morning in November. Evelyn heard about it from Portillo, who had ridden 3 miles to tell her. She stood in the thin winter sunlight outside the land office and felt the satisfaction of it move through her slowly and thoroughly, like warmth after a long cold. Roscoe was standing beside her when Portillo told her. She reached over and put her hand in his, not thinking about it, just doing it, and he closed his fingers around hers. "It was real," she said. "What we did, it was real and it held." "Yes," he said, "it held." They left Dry Hollow on a clear December morning, Evelyn's 2 trunks strapped to a rented wagon, along with Roscoe's considerably more modest collection of belongings. Clara Beaumont stood on the porch of the boarding house and pressed Evelyn's hands between both of hers and said, with the particular warmth of a woman who had watched something unfold under her roof with great private satisfaction, "You come back through, if you ever come this way again." "We will," Evelyn said, and she meant it. The road south was long and cold and beautiful, the way winter roads in New Mexico are, the sky enormous and crystalline, the mesas standing in their ancient silence, the scrub land silver-gray in the low light. They traveled with a small group heading towards Santa Fe, which was sensible in December when the roads were quiet and the territory could still produce its dangers. They made camp at night and talked around fires that snapped and threw light up against the dark. On the second night, lying under separate bedrolls near the fire while the other travelers slept, Roscoe said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She turned her head to look at him. His profile was lit by the dying fire, steady and serious. "I intend to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am not asking tonight. I want to give you time to think about it before I ask, so that when I do ask, you have had time to consider it properly." She was quiet for a moment. The stars above them were enormous and cold and indifferent, which was a comfort rather than otherwise. The world going on in its own vast business while 2 small people lay near a fire and negotiated the terms of something that mattered a great deal. "That is a very practical approach to a proposal," she said. "I am a practical man." "You are," she said, "and I am a practical woman, so let me be equally practical in return. I already know what my answer will be." He turned his head to look at her. In the firelight his eyes were dark and steady. "Do you want to tell me?" he asked. "Or should I still ask when the time comes?" "You should still ask," she said. "Some things deserve to be asked properly." He smiled. The fire crackled. A coyote called somewhere out in the dark, distant and sharp. "All right," he said. "I will ask properly." They reached Santa Fe a week before Christmas, and spent 3 days there giving final depositions related to the Colt case, and meeting with land office officials, and arranging the details of the new appointment. Santa Fe in winter was cold and beautiful, its adobe buildings honey-colored against the pale sky, its streets busy with traders and travelers, and the complex, layered life of a city that had existed for a very long time and contained within it the histories of the Pueblo people, the Spanish colonizers, the Mexican government, and the American territorial authority all at once. Evelyn had always found Santa Fe interesting for exactly that reason, its insistence on being a place with a real past, not just a present. They stayed at a respectable hotel on the plaza. Roscoe paid for separate rooms without discussion, which was appropriate for December of 1878, and Evelyn did not suggest otherwise, which was also appropriate. But on the second evening, they sat for a long time in the hotel's small parlor after supper, talking over coffee, and the conversation moved slowly from the practical to the personal to the quietly profound in the way their conversations had a habit of doing. And at some point very late in the evening he reached across the table and took her hand and simply held it, and neither of them said anything for several minutes. The fire in the parlor grate burned low. The hotel was quiet. "I love you," he said. Not as a declaration exactly, or not only as a declaration, more as a statement of fact that had been true for a while and simply needed to be said aloud. She looked at him. At his face, which she had come to know well enough that she could read the small variations in it, the slight tension that meant he was working something difficult, the particular ease that meant he was comfortable, the warmth that appeared when he looked at her, and that she was no longer even slightly alarmed by because it was simply part of the landscape of being near him. "I love you," she said, also as a statement of fact, also not alarmingly new. He turned her hand over in both of his and looked at it. She had calluses from the survey work, from the chain and the measuring rod and the compass. He traced one of them very gently with his thumb. "Evelyn Wainwright," he said, "I am asking you properly to marry me." She thought about the things she had thought about independence and work, and what marriage meant for women in 1878, and whether she could trust another person with her life in the real, deep sense. And then she thought about the past 9 months, about all the evidence she had accumulated on that question, carefully and methodically, the way she accumulated evidence on everything. She thought about a man who had held her compass while she adjusted a boundary pin and not made a single unnecessary comment, about a man who had said, "I would not want you to be harmed," and had understood immediately the difference between that and "I don't think you can take care of yourself," about a man who had told her she was the most capable person he had met in the territory and had meant it as description, not compliment, which was better than any compliment she had ever received. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in Santa Fe on the last day of December, 1878, with 2 days remaining in the year. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace in his office, witnessed by 2 people they had met in the land office, and who had, upon hearing of the occasion, insisted with charming firmness on being present. Evelyn wore her best dress, which was dark green wool and very practical, and Roscoe wore a clean white shirt and his best boots and had somehow, between breakfast and the ceremony, acquired a small spray of dried wildflowers that he had tied with a piece of string, and which he presented to her with the same matter-of-fact warmth with which he did most things. She had taken the flowers and looked at them and then looked at him and felt the particular fullness of a moment that contains exactly what it was supposed to contain and no more. "Ready?" he said. "Entirely," she said. The new district south of Santa Fe was called the Cielo Rojo District, the Red Sky District, a name given to it by the Spanish colonizers for the extraordinary quality of the light at dusk, which turned the whole sky above the valley a deep, extraordinary crimson that had to be seen to be believed. Evelyn had been warned about the light when she accepted the appointment, but the warning had not been sufficient. On their first evening in the district, she had stood outside the small house they had been given temporary use of, a solid adobe structure on the edge of the town of Cielo Rojo itself, and had watched the sky turn and had felt her breath catch in a way that had very little to do with her professional interest in the landscape. Roscoe had come to stand beside her. He had looked at the sky for a moment and then said, I see why they named it. Yes, she said. The work in Silo Rojo was different from Dry Hollow in its details, but similar in its essential nature: disputed parcels, competing claims, records that needed to be carefully verified against original filings. There was no Harrison Colt here, no organized corruption on that scale. There were instead the ordinary human complications of a frontier community trying to sort out who owned what. Honest disputes between neighbors, boundary markers that had been moved by weather, or by the innocent confusion of people who had been farming a piece of land for 20 years and genuinely believed it was theirs. There were also, in several cases, the injustices visited upon the Pueblo communities, whose land claims predated every piece of American territorial law, and who were frequently, in the administration of those laws, treated as though their prior presence on the land was invisible. Evelyn documented what she found with the same precision she brought to everything else. When 2 of her boundary surveys established that a parcel being actively farmed by a Pueblo family had been incorrectly transferred to a territorial settler's claim, she filed the report that said so, clearly and unambiguously, and submitted it to the land office in Santa Fe, and followed up when the initial response was slow. Roscoe, who had taken on work as a deputy recorder for the district, backed her up at every point. He had, she had discovered, a considerable capacity for quiet, persistent advocacy, the kind that worked not through confrontation, but through the patient repetition of the truth in as many official contexts as possible, until the truth became harder to ignore than to address. The parcel was eventually returned to the Pueblo family, through a process that was slow and frustrating and incomplete in the way that justice in the territory was always incomplete, but real. They had been in Silo Rojo for 4 months when Evelyn realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was certain. When she was certain, she told Roscoe on a Sunday morning over breakfast directly, because she was Evelyn Wainwright and directness was her natural mode. He had been very still for a moment. Then he had set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her across the table, and his face had done something she had not seen it do before. It had opened completely, every careful layer of it, the way a door opens when the person on the other side finally stops being cautious and simply walks through. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he said. She had noted that. "I am very well," she said. He had come around the table and put his hands on either side of her face with the same care with which he had first touched her, and kissed her forehead, and said nothing for a long moment, which said a great deal. "I want to write to my mother," he said, when he finally spoke. "She will want to know." Ruth Monroe, who had been keeping the farm in Missouri going with the help of a neighbor and a great deal of personal fortitude, wrote back in 6 weeks with a letter that was 3 pages long, warm and direct and enormously gratifying, and which contained, among other things, the information that she would be coming to visit in the fall, a statement that was not quite a question. "She is not asking," Evelyn said, reading the letter. "No," Roscoe agreed, with the small, fond exasperation of a son who has spent his whole life recognizing that his mother is a force of nature. "She is not asking." Ruth Monroe arrived in Silo Rojo in September, 3 weeks before the baby was due, which was good timing and entirely intentional. She was a small, straight-backed woman in her late 50s with sharp, dark eyes and her son's quality of complete presence. She looked at Evelyn for approximately 30 seconds when they met on the porch of the adobe house, and then she said, "You are the woman who walked into a room with a gun in it to help my son." "Among other things," Evelyn said. "Yes," Ruth said. "I had that impression." She stepped forward and embraced Evelyn, not gently. "Good." Evelyn had not expected to like her mother-in-law as much as she did. She had been prepared to respect her, which was not the same thing. Ruth was intelligent and practical and had strong opinions that she expressed clearly and without apology, and she did not treat Evelyn's work as a curiosity or an eccentricity, but as a vocation, which Evelyn had found in the year since Dry Hollow was still rarer than it should have been. The baby came in October, on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. It was a boy. He arrived loudly, and with an evident sense of grievance about the transition from one state of being to another, which Evelyn found, through the considerable difficulty of his arrival, entirely characteristic of someone who was half Wainwright and half Monroe. They named him Daniel Thomas Monroe. Daniel for Roscoe's brother, whose death had set in motion everything that had led to his parents finding each other, and Thomas for Evelyn's father, who was still alive in Albuquerque and who received the news by telegram and replied, in the economical style of a man who had spent his life making measurements, with 3 words: magnificent. Come soon. Daniel Thomas Monroe was, from his first days, entirely himself. He was a substantial, vigorous child who expressed his preferences loudly and explored his surroundings with a systematic thoroughness that his mother recognized as professional and his father recognized as genetic. He had Roscoe's dark eyes and Evelyn's precise, observant expression, which combination produced on his face something that both of them found deeply startling in the best possible way. Ruth Monroe stayed for 6 weeks, which was long enough to establish herself as indispensable and also long enough to begin the process of genuine friendship with Evelyn that would continue, through letters and visits, for the rest of both their lives. When she left, she embraced Evelyn again and then held her at arm's length and said, "You are good for him, not because you soften him, because you match him." Evelyn had thought about that for a long time afterward. The Silo Rojo appointment lasted 2 years. At the end of it, with the district's records in order and the disputed parcels resolved, Evelyn was offered a new appointment in the northern part of the territory, near Taos, which was a district with complex land history and a particular need for someone with her combination of technical skill and experience with contested claims. Near Taos, near the land that Roscoe had sold to pursue justice for his brother. He had said nothing about it when she showed him the appointment offer. She had watched him read it and had waited. "The Northern District," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Daniel, who was now nearly a year old and had graduated from vigorous crawling to vigorous and somewhat terrifying early walking, was with Ruth, who had come to visit again, in the small walled garden, and his occasional loud commentary on whatever he was investigating filtered through the open window. "There is a parcel of land I know up there," Roscoe said, "between Taos and the Rio Grande. I looked at it once years ago when I was considering expanding before I sold the original place. 120 acres, good soil in the valley bottom, water from a reliable spring." She looked at him. And I have been saving money for 2 years, he said. I have not mentioned it because I was not certain of the right moment to mention it. She understood then what he was telling her. "You want to buy it back. Not the original land. That has different owners now and they have built on it. But this other parcel, the one I know, I want to put down roots, Evelyn. I want a place that is ours, that is permanent, that Daniel grows up knowing as home." He paused. "If that is something you want too." She thought about the 2 large trunks she had arrived in Dry Hollow with, and all the places she had lived since she was a child, temporary houses and boarding rooms and survey camps, the beautiful transients of a life spent measuring other people's land. She thought about the adobe house in Silo Rojo, which she had liked more than she expected to like a house, because it was their house, hers and Roscoe's, the first place she had lived that was organized around her own life, rather than being simply a temporary shelter from which she conducted it. She thought about Daniel, who had learned to walk in that house, and who would learn many other things in whatever house came next. "I want that too," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had never fully named in all the time since she had first seen it in the lurching lamplight of the Dry Hollow land office. She had stopped trying to name it, not because it had become less significant, but because she had come to understand that it did not need a name. It was simply the way he looked at her, and it was one of the things that was true about her life. They bought the land in the spring of 1881. 120 acres in a valley between Taos and the Rio Grande, with good soil and reliable water and mountains visible in 3 directions. They did not buy it alone. Thomas Wainwright, Evelyn's father, who had recovered enough in the past 2 years that his cough no longer alarmed his doctor, contributed a portion of the purchase, not as a loan but as an investment in his daughter's future, and he made clear with his characteristic precision that this was what he intended and that he expected no repayment. He came to visit that first summer, taking the stage from Albuquerque in good weather, and Evelyn had watched him walk the perimeter of the land with Roscoe beside him, the two of them talking in the particular language of men who understood land measurement, stopping at the corners to examine the boundary markers, and had felt something complete in it. Her father liked Roscoe. He liked him in the specific way that a man who has spent his life teaching a daughter to be precise and thorough likes the person who takes that precision and thoroughness seriously. He liked the questions Roscoe asked. He liked that Roscoe listened to the answers. He liked that when Evelyn was explaining something technical, Roscoe paid attention. "He is a good man," her father told her simply on the last evening before he took the stage back. They were sitting on the porch of the house they were building, still partly unfinished, its walls solid but its rooms still taking shape around them in the long summer evening. "He is," she said. "You chose well," her father said. "We chose each other," she said. Thomas Wainwright smiled. "Yes," he said. "That is the right way to put it." The house took the better part of a year to build properly, done in stages as money and time allowed, with Roscoe doing a great portion of the physical work himself and hiring out the parts that exceeded his skills. It was adobe in the New Mexico tradition, thick-walled and cool in summer and warm in winter, built around a central room that served as kitchen and gathering place, with a porch that faced east toward the mountains. Evelyn continued her work. The Taos district appointment overlapped with the building of the house, and she conducted her surveys from a temporary base in Taos itself until the house was ready, and then from the house, which turned out to have an excellent view of much of the territory she was responsible for, and which Roscoe had, unprompted, arranged to include a proper workspace, a large table with good light from 2 windows, and shelving built specifically to her specifications, and a secure cabinet for documents and instruments. She had stood in that workspace on the day it was completed and looked at the shelving and the cabinet and the big table in the good light, and had felt a love for him that was so specific and so thorough that it had taken her a moment to find words for it. "This is exactly right," she said. He was in the doorway. "I measured it 3 times," he said. She had laughed. He had crossed the room and she had put her arms around him and said, into the wool of his shirt, "You measured my workspace." "I wanted it to be correct." "It is correct," she said. "It is entirely correct." He held her. Outside, Daniel, who was now 2.5 and entirely dedicated to the project of investigating everything within reach, could be heard interrogating a lizard in the front garden. The mountains were visible through the east window. The late afternoon light was that particular New Mexico gold that she had come to love with a physical, unironic intensity. Her second appointment in the Taos district ran 3 years. At the end of it, with the district's records in the best order they had ever been, and a formal report submitted to the Territorial Land Office that was, according to the director's reply, exemplary, Evelyn was offered a permanent position in Santa Fe as a consulting surveyor for the territorial government, reviewing disputed land claims across the entire territory. She had been offered the position partly because of her record and partly because of what she had done in Dry Hollow, which had become, in the 3 years since, something of a known case among territorial law officials. It was, as far as she was aware, the first time such a permanent consulting position had been offered to a woman in the territory. She had told Roscoe about the offer over supper, Daniel having been put to bed, the house quiet around them in the way it was at its best lived in and warm and specific to their particular life together. He had listened, and then he had said, "Santa Fe is only 60 miles. Yes, we could stay here. You could travel to Santa Fe as needed." The consulting work could be done largely from here with periodic travel. She looked at him. You have thought about this already. I thought about it when you first heard from the land office that something of this nature was being considered, he said. That was 2 months ago. She had not known he was aware of the preliminary inquiry. He saw the surprise on her face and said with a mild expression, Ezra Flood moved to Santa Fe last year. He is the postmaster there now. He occasionally writes. Evelyn sat back in her chair. You have an intelligence network, she said. I have friends who write letters, he said. The distinction is significant. She had laughed, which he had clearly intended, and the laughter had moved into something quieter and more serious, and she had said, I want to accept it. I want to do this work at the scale it is being offered. Then accept it, he said, simply, without any shadow of hesitation. It will mean travel, she said, sometimes extended. I can run the land here and take care of Daniel, he said, and when the travel is extended and the season allows, I will bring Daniel and we will come with you. She had looked at him for a long moment. You would do that? Of course, he said, as though the question were slightly strange in its obviousness. She accepted the appointment. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary griefs and frustrations of a life being actively lived, but rich with purpose and with love, and with the particular satisfaction of work that matters. The Harrison Colt case had been, as it turned out, the first of several significant investigations that Evelyn's work either initiated or supported. Her reputation in the territory grew, not dramatically but steadily, the way good reputations grow, through the accumulation of careful work done consistently over time. She was consulted, eventually, by surveyors in other territories. She wrote 2 monographs on land fraud detection methodology that were circulated by the Department of the Interior. She was, in 1884, invited to present her findings on the Dry Hollow case and its aftermath at a federal land management conference in Washington, an invitation she accepted, and a trip she took with Roscoe beside her and Daniel, aged 4, astonished by the city in the particular way of a child from the New Mexico territory encountering the urban East. Daniel's astonishment had been instructive. He had asked more questions about Washington in 3 days than most people asked in a lifetime, and had been dissatisfied with any answer that was not complete, and had on one occasion reduced a fairly senior official from the Department of the Interior to a state of mild helpless laughter through the force of his curiosity. He is exactly like you, Roscoe had said that evening back at the hotel. He is exactly like both of us, Evelyn said. Roscoe had looked at their son, who was at that moment attempting to take apart a drawer pull with the focused intensity of a small engineer, and had smiled. They had a second child in 1885, a boy they named Eli Thomas Monroe, who arrived in the summer when the valley below the mountains was green from the summer rains, and who was, from his first days, the exact opposite of his brother in temperament. Where Daniel was loud and systematic, Eli was quiet and watchful, large-eyed, taking everything in with a placid thoroughness that Roscoe recognized from somewhere internal. He thinks before he acts, Roscoe observed when Eli was about 6 months old. Versus Daniel, Evelyn said, versus Daniel. They had looked at each other and laughed in the way that parents laugh about their children, with the love in it entirely unmistakable, and the exhaustion, and the wonder. Roscoe's land work had, in those years, expanded beyond the original 120 acres. He had purchased an additional 80 acres to the north, built a proper barn, begun raising horses in a serious way. He had also, through the reputation that had come from his work in the Dry Hollow and Silo Rojo districts, and his position as deputy recorder, become someone that other landowners in the area came to when they needed advice on boundary disputes and record issues, which was often, and which he handled with the same calm, methodical competence with which he handled everything else. Thomas Wainwright visited every year until he could no longer travel, and then they went to him, making the trip to Albuquerque in the spring when the roads were clear. And he sat with his grandchildren in the small house he had lived in since before Evelyn was born and was visibly, entirely happy. He died in the spring of 1888, not suddenly but not lingering. He had lived, Evelyn thought, exactly as he had always lived, with precision and purpose, and had set down his life when it was time with the same matter-of-fact clarity with which he had conducted it. She had cried. She had not known how much she would, but she had cried thoroughly and without restraint, which was not something she did often, and Roscoe had held her through it without saying anything that was not exactly right, which was the specific comfort she had needed. Ruth Monroe lived until 1893, sharp-eyed and opinionated until the end, making her yearly visit to the New Mexico territory until she was 81 years old, which was old enough that even she conceded the journey was perhaps too much. She and Evelyn had written to each other every month without exception from their first meeting. When Ruth died in Missouri, Evelyn received the news by telegram and sat with it for a long time, and then wrote a letter to the neighbor who had sent the telegram describing Ruth as she had known her, as a woman of fierce practicality and genuine warmth, who had given her a son, and who had been, in her own right, one of the people Evelyn was grateful to have known. Harrison Colt served 8 of his 12 years before dying in the territorial prison in 1886 of a lung ailment, which was the kind of ending that was neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, simply final. Evelyn heard about it from Marshal Devers, who still wrote to her occasionally on matters of mutual professional interest. She told Roscoe that evening simply as a fact. He had nodded. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel's deed is on record. His land is restored. The people Colt wronged have their titles back. That is what matters." "Yes," she said, "that is what matters." The case of Daniel Monroe had never been formally closed. The investigation into the circumstances of his death had remained open and had produced no final prosecution, partly because the primary witness against whoever had actually killed Daniel had been unavailable throughout the trial and had never been located. It was the thread in the whole matter that had never fully resolved, and Evelyn knew that Roscoe carried it, not as an open wound exactly but as a permanent fact of his inner landscape. She had asked him about it once directly in the way she asked about everything. They had been sitting on the porch of the house in the late evening, the mountains dark against the last light, Daniel asleep inside, Eli still very young and sleeping too, the rare quiet of the house around them. "Does it still feel unfinished?" she asked. He had thought about it. "Yes," he said, "but I have learned to make peace with unfinished. The world is full of things that do not get fully closed. What I know is true. Daniel was a good man who did nothing wrong and was killed for it. His land is restored. The man responsible for his death spent years in prison, which was not adequate but was something. And I have built a life that Daniel would have recognized as good, which is perhaps what he would have wanted me to do more than anything else." She had put her hand over his on the porch railing. He had turned his palm up and taken her hand. "He would have liked you," he said. "Daniel. He would have said you were extraordinary, and then he would have tried to find something practical to help you with, because that was how he showed affection." She had smiled. "He sounds like someone I know." "Yes," Roscoe said, "I suppose he does." They sat on the porch while the night came in from the mountains and the stars appeared over the valley, more stars than seemed possible. The Milky Way laid across the sky like a river of light. The horses in the barn were quiet. The house was warm and solid behind them. "I want to tell you something," Evelyn said. "Tell me," he said. "I was afraid," she said, "in Dry Hollow." "Not of Harrison Colt. I was frightened of him, which is a different thing. I was afraid of you, of what I felt when I looked at you. It was the most frightening thing in Dry Hollow, which was full of frightening things." He was quiet, listening. "I had worked very hard," she said, "to make myself into someone who could not be diminished by love. I had watched it happen to women I knew, this diminishment, and I had been determined that it would not happen to me. And then I walked into that office and you were there, and I thought with absolute clarity, this is the thing I have been trying to avoid. She paused. And then I thought, it is not going to diminish me. I do not know how I knew that, but I knew it. He turned to look at her. The stars were very bright behind him. I knew it because of how you treated me, she said. From the very beginning, you treated my knowledge as knowledge, my work as work, my judgment as judgment. No one had done that so completely, so naturally since my father. She looked at their joined hands. So I was afraid, but I was not afraid of the right things. I was afraid of losing myself, and instead I found more of myself, which I had not known was possible. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I was afraid too. She looked up. I had not let myself want anything for a long time, he said, since Daniel died. I had reduced everything down to the work of finding out what happened to him. And then I very nearly rode my horse over your survey chain, and you looked up at me and said, watch where you are going, and I thought he stopped. Started again. I thought this is a problem, because I knew immediately even then that you were going to matter, and I did not have room at the time for something that mattered. You found room, she said. You made it impossible not to, he said, and there was warmth in his voice and also something older than warmth, something that had been through difficulty and had come out on the other side as knowledge. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. They sat that way while the night settled completely over the valley and the mountains and the red land of New Mexico, and the stars moved slowly overhead in their ancient, indifferent procession. And inside the house, their sons slept in the particular complete unconsciousness of children who are safe and loved and unaware, which was the best possible thing for them to be. In 1891, Daniel was 12 years old and entirely occupied with the project of learning everything there was to know about surveying, which he had begun to study with his mother with the same systematic intensity he brought to all things. He had her aptitude for numbers and his father's patience for detail, which combination made him, Evelyn thought, naturally suited to the work. He was also, by 12, clearly going to be very tall, which meant he spent a certain portion of each day being startled by his own legs. Eli was 6, and was developing a passionate interest in horses that was wholly his own, derived from neither parent's particular inclinations, and which Roscoe had recognized immediately as a genuine vocation, and had begun nurturing with quiet, specific attention. That spring, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, which she told Roscoe on a morning in April while they were both drinking coffee at the kitchen table, and the boys had gone out to see to the horses. He had looked at her over his coffee cup with an expression that was joy, pure and simple and without complication, the expression of a man for whom this news arrived in a life that was solid enough to hold it. "Are you well?" he said, which was still always the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table. He bent and kissed the top of her head. He said, with his chin resting on her hair, "Daniel is going to be insufferable about this." "He is going to be wonderful about this," she said. "He will have organized all the information he can find about infant development within 48 hours of being told." "That is what I mean by insufferable," Roscoe said. She had laughed, leaning back against him. The 3rd child arrived in October and was a girl, and they named her Ruth Evelyn Monroe, for Roscoe's mother and her own name, which was a doubling she had thought about carefully and had decided was exactly right. Ruth Evelyn Monroe arrived in the world with a quantity of dark hair and an air of calm authority that had everyone in the house immediately convinced that she was entirely in charge. Daniel, who had in fact spent 48 hours in the period after being told the news researching infant development in every book available to him in the Taos library, was 12 years old and completely undone by her. He held her with the careful, focused attention he brought to precision instruments, and looked at her face with an expression of total gravity that made both his parents have to look away to compose themselves. "She is very small," he said. "She was considerably smaller this morning," Roscoe told him. "She will grow," Evelyn said, "considerably and rapidly. "I know," Daniel said. He looked at his sister. "I will help," he said, with the air of someone making a professional commitment. Eli, aged 6, looked at his new sister for approximately 30 seconds and then said, "Can I go back to the horses now?" The horses could wait, they told him. He waited with patient, evident resignation. The years after that were the years of the family fully assembled, which had a quality that Evelyn recognized as what her father had meant when he used the word home. Not a place exactly, though the place mattered, but a configuration of people, a particular arrangement of love and habit and purpose that made the world legible in the way that a good survey made the land legible. Dry Hollow remained in their past, formative and important, visited occasionally in conversation and correspondence. Ezra Flood wrote reliably from Santa Fe. Clara Beaumont's boarding house had been converted to a general store after Clara's death in 1887. Portillo sent a letter every Christmas with news of his family and his land, which was still his and still productive. The town itself had grown and changed and become less raw, the way frontier towns did when the most violent phase of their history was over, and ordinary life moved back in to fill the space. Evelyn went back once, in 1893, for a survey-related consultation in the county. She had ridden through the familiar Main Street on a clear autumn morning and felt the layered quality of the past, the specific emotional texture of those 11 days in November of 1878, the gun and the lamp and the dust on the floor, and the look on Roscoe Monroe's face when she said, "Neither do I, but do not stop." It was 15 years ago. It felt both recent and long ago, the way the most important things always do. She had written to Roscoe that night from the Dry Hollow Hotel, the same hotel, still operating, slightly less decrepit now, describing the town and what it felt like to be back in it. She had written, near the end of the letter, "I was thinking today about that first night. About the things that were set in motion. I do not think either of us could have mapped where it would lead, starting from that room, but I find I am very satisfied with the territory we covered." His reply had arrived 7 days later as she was making her way back north. It read, "I have been thinking the same thing. Come home. The boys are fine, Ruth asks for you, and I have been sleeping on the wrong side of the bed for 2 weeks, which is a personal failing I prefer to correct as soon as possible. I love you. Come home." She had come home on a Friday evening in late October, when the mountains were snow-capped, and the valley below the house was golden with autumn grass, and the light was the long, low, amber light of the territory in October that she had loved since the first time she saw it. She had ridden the last mile from Taos, knowing the route so completely that the horse barely needed direction, through the familiar gate, up the familiar approach, and the house had been lit from within against the darkening sky, warm and solid, and Roscoe had been on the porch when she rode up, which meant he had been watching for her. She had dismounted, and he had taken the horse's reins and tied them at the hitching post and then turned to her, and she had walked into his arms with the ease of something that had been done 10,000 times and was still, always still, the exact right thing. "You are home," he said. "I am home," she said. Inside, Ruth, at 2 years old, had many and elaborate opinions about the return of her mother and expressed them at considerable volume. Daniel, now 14 and attempting a dignity that was mostly successful, had organized a welcome supper and was visibly pleased with himself about it. Eli, 8 years old, had decided to demonstrate his welcome by showing her everything the horses had done in the 2 weeks she was gone, which required considerable time. She had let herself be welcomed. She had sat at her own table and eaten the supper her oldest son had organized and watched her youngest try to explain horse behavior to a 2-year-old who had her own theories about everything. And she had looked across the table at Roscoe, who was watching all of it with that expression she had never fully named and never needed to. And she had felt the deep, uncomplicated truth of a life that was exactly what it was meant to be. In 1895, The Territorial Land Office offered Evelyn a position that was entirely new director of the Survey Division for the New Mexico Territory, a title that had not previously existed and which had been, in part, created to formalize a role she had been effectively playing for the past several years through her consulting work. The position came with an office in Santa Fe and a formal charter to establish survey standards and practices across the whole territory. She had accepted. She had been 43 years old, and she had accepted it with the same directness with which she had accepted everything else. The Santa Fe years were the most professionally expansive of her life. She built a division, hired staff, including, over the course of several years, 3 women surveyors who had been told, as she had been told, that the work was not for them, and who were good at it for exactly the same reason that she was good at it, which was that they were good at it, and established practices that were later adopted by other Western territories and eventually by the federal land management agencies. Roscoe managed the land north of Taos with the help of 2 hired hands and spent considerable time in Santa Fe alongside her, which was possible because Daniel, at 18, was capable of running the horse operation with a competence that had stopped being surprising somewhere around his 15th birthday. Eli at 13 had the horses in hand in a way that sometimes made his father redundant, which Roscoe had described once as an excellent problem to have. They had, in those Santa Fe years, a life that was both larger and more settled than anything they had imagined in a lurching-lamped land office in Dry Hollow 17 years before. They had a small house in Santa Fe for the weeks they were in the city, and the land north of Taos for everything else, and they moved between the two with the ease of people who had been moving through the territory their whole lives, and for whom motion was simply part of the texture of living. Ruth Evelyn Monroe grew up opinionated and precise and fearless, which surprised no one. She had her mother's gift for numbers and her father's gift for reading people, and at 10, she was already assisting Evelyn in the survey office with an air of professional confidence that made the actual professionals feel, occasionally, slightly inadequate. She asked every question fully and waited for complete answers and argued when she disagreed and acknowledged when she was wrong. And Evelyn found, watching her, the particular and extraordinary satisfaction of seeing something of yourself in someone you love. Daniel married at 23, a young woman named Lucia Portillo, granddaughter of the man who had given testimony that had helped bring Harrison Colt to justice, which connection made Evelyn feel, when she heard about it, the beautiful, unexpected circularity of things. Lucia was direct and warm and gave as good as she got in any argument with Daniel, which was the necessary qualification for the role. They built a house on a parcel of land adjacent to the Monroe property, and within 3 years had given Evelyn and Roscoe a grandson named Thomas, and then, 2 years later, a second grandson named Roscoe Jr., who was immediately and universally called Junior in a way that suggested the name was unlikely to change. Eli never married, not by 40 at least, which was a choice he made clearly and without particular concern for anyone else's theories about it, and which Roscoe and Evelyn had respected without comment because it was his choice, and he was their son, and his happiness was not contingent on following any particular path. He did, instead, build one of the finest horse operations in the territory, which was a different kind of building and no less valid. The year 1898 was the last year of the New Mexico Territory as the governing structure within which Evelyn had done all of her work, though statehood was still more than a decade away in practice. The territory was changing, had been changing for 20 years, the wildest and most violent phase of its history retreating further into the past as the land was mapped, and the law was established, and the communities that had seemed so precarious in 1878 became, incrementally and imperfectly, something more stable. Evelyn was 46. Roscoe was 50. Ruth was 7. Daniel was 20 and already surveying under his mother's supervision. Eli was 14 and in command of more horses than anyone strictly needed. They rode out together on a Sunday morning in the spring of that year, just the two of them, which they managed occasionally when the various claims of the household and the work and the children allowed for it. They rode north from the house into the higher country, where the pines came in and the air was thin and cold even in May, and they rode side by side without talking much, which was the comfortable silence of people who had said everything that needed to be said and had not run out of things to say, but had simply reached a point in their shared life where silence was also a form of speech. They stopped on a ridge above the valley. Below them, the land stretched out in its ancient arrangement, the valley floor, the river line, the red and brown and gold of the desert to the south, the mountains above them going white at the peaks. The house was visible below, small and solid, with the barn behind it and the horse paddocks and the orderly geometry of the kitchen garden. Evelyn looked at it, all of it. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "About what it means," she said, "to make the invisible visible. What my father meant when he said that. I have spent my life drawing lines on land, establishing what belongs where, making the boundaries real. And I think," she paused, looking for the right words, which were not always easy to find even after a lifetime of precision. "I think the real invisible thing was not the boundary lines. They were just the work. The real invisible thing was everything that happened alongside the work, everything I was finding out about my own life while I was drawing those lines." He looked at her. "I did not know," she said, "when I rode into Dry Hollow in 1878 what I was riding into. I thought I was going to survey some disputed parcels, and I did survey them, but that was not the most important thing I found there." "No," he said. "You were the most important thing I found there," she said. "And I did not know how to call it that first night. I still do not know how to call it entirely, but I have made peace with not knowing, because whatever it is the realest thing in my life. It makes everything else make sense." He reached over from his horse and took her hand the way he did, the way he had always done, without theater, without unnecessary gesture, simply taking her hand because it was his hand to take. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. Below them, the valley held its ancient patient silence. The mountains stood in the clear May sky. Somewhere down in the paddocks, Eli's horses moved in their unhurried circles. Inside the house, Ruth was probably reorganizing something that did not need reorganizing. Daniel's house, a quarter-mile to the east, showed a thin line of smoke from the morning fire. This was the territory they had mapped together. Not the land was always there, patient and indifferent, waiting to be understood. But the other territory, the one that had no official chart, the one that began in a doorway with a gun in a man's chest, and two people looking at each other across the wreckage of a bad situation and finding, in that look, something neither of them had anticipated. Neither of them had known what to call it. Neither of them had stopped. And the life that had grown from that refusal to stop, the years of work and children and grief and laughter, and ordinary Tuesday mornings and extraordinary October evenings, and the specific warmth of being known completely by one person who chose to stay, was the most precise thing Evelyn Wainwright Monroe had ever mapped, and the most true. The horses moved on the ridge. The valley waited below. The sun came fully over the mountains and lit everything. The red land and the green pines and the white peaks and the small solid house, and the two people who had built it, sitting their horses side by side on a ridge in the territory in the spring of 1898, in possession of a life that was fully, completely, exactly theirs.